Tonight, we're very fortunate to have former Representative Keith Fitzgerald speak to us tonight. And Keith taught for 40 years, and he retired from New College before some of the major changes at New College. And so Keith earned his Ph.D. from Indiana University in public policy and political theory. His specialization has been one that's really right on point these days. He was studying the interaction of political institutions, political rhetoric, and public policy, and his major research focus has been on immigration, culminating in a book, The Face of the Nation, the State Immigration Policy and National Identity. So there's a book for some afternoon reading. His teaching and research followed the development of policies such as immigration policy and its impact on the definition of citizenship in the United States from the Cold War until the present. I know from comments that I've heard in town, being a Sarasota resident for many years, that Keith was very good about being a mentor for his students. And that's something that he can be very proud of. And many of his students have gone on to really great accomplishments, and that's thanks to Keith's good leadership. He has a long record of political action, and we certainly need political action these days. He has worked at every level of politics, from precinct captain to a delegate to 2 different state party conventions. He's been a speechwriter and policy advisor for other candidates, including being the policy director for 2 different gubernatorial campaigns. He was vice chair and state committee woman for Sarasota Democrats and served as the leader of the state party's turnaround task force, which gathered experts from across the state to plan improvements for the party. In 2008, he was an official surrogate for the Obama presidential campaign and had the privilege of campaigning with President Obama. Professor Fitzgerald became Representative Fitzgerald when he won a seat in the Florida House of Representatives. And that's not easy to do around here. And it's one of the deepest, reddest areas of the country, and which Jamie Raskin calls the belly of the beast. So he's to be commended for that. He rose quickly in the leadership, and he became the Democratic caucus chair in his second term. He's authored successful housing policy legislation that has put thousands of people into homes. And we know that's a big problem here in Florida. I mean, we all know that housing is something that's very difficult unless it's getting to the point that you almost have to be wealthy to be able to afford to live in Florida. Representative Fitzgerald ran for the U.S. Congress in 2010 against Vern Buchanan, who has a long-term, I don't know how many terms he served now, probably 8, something like that. And I'll tell you a little story about Florida Veterans for Common Sense. When we first started, we campaigned against Buchanan in the Republican primary because he basically told us that he was against the Iraq War, but then he did everything to support it. And we supported his opponent in the Republican primary, who was really strong against it, Nancy Dietert. And I'm sad to say this, but Nancy lost by 250 votes. So that's a little bit of history of our group. And while Keith lost that race, his race was in the top 2% of incumbent challenges. More recently, Keith has worked as a consultant helping younger candidates get a start. And one of the candidates that he worked with, I'm sure there's others, but one that we know of is Derek Rice. So Keith, certainly welcome. Help us out.
Thank you very much for that generous introduction. I couldn't have written it better myself. That's because I did. No, I don't do these things very often, and I used to have a standard bio, but I had to go back and do it from scratch, so I appreciate being here tonight. Now, let me tell you what I'd like to talk about. I'm taking a risk with you guys because what I really would like to do is bring you some completely different perspectives on the election and elections generally, informed by my academic discipline, which is political science. Most people, when they think of political science, they don't really believe it has anything to offer, but it actually does. And there are things we know about elections. And so interpreting what happened here can be done from a framework of people who've been doing literally 60 years of really hard, serious, empirical research. So one of the things I want to do is give you a sense of how you might look at this thing from that kind of a perspective, and then talk about the election and what it means. And then I'll conclude in doing more speculative stuff about what we really may need or want to be thinking about as we move forward into an extremely uncertain future. And I want to start with something that I think is almost universal among people on the progressive side of things, which is a sense of shock in the American people, a belief, a discovery suddenly that many of our fellow Americans are extremely superficial in the way that they think about politics, are extremely subjected to demagogic appeals, operate much out of emotion and anxiety, and not so much out of a sense of moral commitment to large values. Do you all think that? Do you feel in that way? So let me tell you from a scholar standpoint, some good news and some bad news. The good news is the American people have not changed. The bad news is they've always been that way. So there was once an obscure professor at the University of Michigan by the name of Philip Converse. It's 1964. And he had the ability to take advantage of some of the first really excellent data gathering exercises in how elections worked. And he went to work analyzing them. And here's essentially what his findings were in 1964. The vast majority of the American people have no discernible ideology. The vast majority of the American people don't normally connect fundamental moral precepts and moral values that they may follow in their own life into the political sphere. Most people don't make much of an effort to inform themselves and are, again, quite subject to emotional, demagogic, and symbolic appeals. And that was the finding in 1964, and it's never changed. So that should lead to the question, if it's really not the people, and by the way, let me just say, to defend folks, most people don't know much about auto mechanics. I don't know anything about auto mechanics. I go to the mechanic and talk about the mechanics. Then I learn about consumer research to find out which mechanic is a crook, and so on and so forth. There's something wrong with me for not being a mechanic. People specialize in things. Most people go about their life sort of accepting that politics takes care of itself and it doesn't really have much to do with them. So it's not really out of malicious intent that they don't behave in a way better than we might think they ought to. It's just what it's like living in a great big complicated society where we all have many, many things on our plate. And a lot of people look at politics very much like other hobbies. You like sports? Oh, he's into politics, that sort of a thing. So if the people haven't changed, what has changed? And this is where the message gets a little bit political sciencey. Because what has changed is the institutional context. And what I mean by institutions, nothing magical. It does include formal organizations like Congress, the Democratic Party, the Republican Party, the National Association of Manufacturers, which is a big interest group, and so on and so forth. So organizations are part of it. But the institutions are also the way we do things to get things done in the political sphere. The established standard operating procedures, the protocols, the various different legal frameworks within which people operate. All that stuff, again, is extremely complicated, and it's not transparent to most voters or most citizens in any particular way. But all of that has changed in dramatic ways since the 1960s. And some of the expressions of it are really obvious. In the same data gathering exercise that started in the 1950s that Converse used in 1964 is ongoing to this very day. And in fact, the new data set with the results of the last election will be coming out, and then a bunch of people trying to get tenure will be churning it to death with a bunch of statistical models, which is what they do. But let's talk about what has changed. And I'm going to give you a concept. Just go with me. There won't be an exam. Let's talk about this as a concept we have in my profession called the regime. What the regime means is the overall picture of how these institutions relate, how they relate to the people, how they relate to each other, how power actually operates. And there are characteristics of these regimes that can be described and understood. So let's go back and look at what life looked like in 1964. First of all, there's another thing that's important with the regime I wanted to emphasize as well, and that's something I'll call ethos. The general sense of our moral commitment, a general sense that might unite us as a people in some sense of collective action, so that some are willing to make sacrifices for the all. Ethos is an important part of a political regime. It can be used by powerful people to manipulate and to contain power and do what they want while fooling people. But on the other hand, without an ethos, you have the sheer exercise of power for power's sake. So that ethos is an important thing that the regime sort of has to support somehow. So the first thing we want to notice is the ethos has collapsed. And it's collapsed not so much among the average voter, where it was not as strong as we might have liked to have believed. We can talk about why. But it's especially collapsed among the political class. And that's because the incentives for people to go into politics, the strategies that work, the predominant way you get to the top is antithetical to a moral commitment. That has to do with the corruption of the entire institutional arrangement. Well, what happened since 1960? Well, think, in 1960, your political party was probably working with you individually, and you had some connection with them. And that right there provided a real link between the people in power. That's not there anymore. Used to be the case that you would look at what politicians actually did after an election, and you would see there was a huge amount of fidelity to the promises they made in the campaign. Who knew? But it's what the evidence says. And they were honorable about it in most respects. Now, the connection between the campaign, the rhetoric, what they're saying they're going to do, who they say they're going to help, is not existent. Let me just pick an example out of random. In 2005, 1965, I think it was, the Republicans passed a gigantic tax cut for the rich. They have a habit of doing that. And someone wrote a really brilliant study about it, because what they started with is, where was the polling and all this stuff on tax cuts for the rich? People hated the idea. Hated it. Hated it. It passed, and it had disastrous consequences, being one of the major pieces of legislation that has changed the distribution of economic goods in the society in a dramatic way. And this is one of the changes in the context. Grotesque inequality. More important, after this was over, the Republican Party went on a big campaign to tell people how good it was, and when it was all said and done, there were no consequences in the polling, in the elections, or anything else for delivering a policy that was precisely the opposite of what everybody knew the people wanted. Now, if you're having elections and there aren't any connections between the outcomes of the elections and what the government does, and there's no cost to pay, that is a dramatic change in the way the system works from when it did back in the day. Now, what do you think would be the long-term result of that in people's attitudes about politics? In 1964, when they would ask people the question, do you trust the government to do what's right for you? Most of the time, the numbers were always strongly in the majority. 60, 70% of the people believed that the government was on their side. Today, the numbers are atrocious. Trust doesn't exist. You can't have a responsible Republican government, and I mean Republican with a small r, where the people are involved in the governance itself, if there's no trust level. One of the things when you don't have trust is, this is an important point that Hannah Arendt, the political philosopher, made about the rise of fascism in Europe. The point of all the lies is not to mislead you about what the truth is. The point of all the lies is to make you believe nothing. We incult cynicism. I used to tell students, cynicism is analytically stupid, because you short-circuit the hard work of figuring out how things work, and you resort to nasty impositions of attributing bad motives and see everything as a conspiracy, and you're powerless because you really don't know anything. And there really isn't any basis for collective action among a bunch of cynics. And if you want to see the walking manifestation of cynicism, look at Robert F. Kennedy Jr. That stuff he says is nonsense. He's a bright man. He knows it's all a bunch of nonsense. People will believe anything because they don't believe anything. If the medical community says polio vaccines save, and I know people with polio who are still alive, save millions of lives and save millions of people from misery, well, if somebody else says, no, that's not true, it causes cancer. Who knows? So part of what you're seeing in the behavior of people in falling for extreme demagogic appeals is the fact that there has been an erosion of the basic trust and the connection, the democratic connection between the people and the government. It causes great anger and frustration. It's a change in the political regime. Now, where did it come from? Again, our political culture is a mixed bag of good things and bad things. Racist, heroes against racism. We could go on and on of different dichotomies. We're not perfect. But over time, you had this sense that we were moving towards something. But, the Democrats did a really nice job of building a big administrative state, and big bureaucracies are a mess. They're hard for people to understand. And one of the other things they did is they created and affiliated themselves with a vast bunch of experts. There are more experts in the Democratic Party than you can shake a stick at. And they're highly trained in specific areas, and they know what they're doing. But by virtue of that training, they're distant from the people and subject to mischaracterization. Now I'm going to turn on that comment to the nature of what the Democratic Party is, because it's a problem. In 1964, the core base of the Democratic Party was in organized labor. Is organized labor a force in American politics today in any way, shape, or form as it was in those days? No. 11% of the private workforce is unionized. Okay, so that connection between the party and the working man was destroyed over a long period of years with intention. It doesn't exist anymore. Now look at who the Democratic Party is. Lawyers, professors, environmental scientists, all kinds of people with very big degrees who appear to have a great deal of power over common people. And the unifying factor within the Republican Party that makes them behave in solidarity, and if you're honest with yourself, you may know this to be true, the unifying factor, the factor of cohesion, if you want a nice term, for the Republican Party is hatred of elites. And who is the elite Democratic Party? It's the Democratic Party. I was on a turnaround task force. I put it in the intro for this reason. The Democrats got pasted in an election. They put together a bunch of smart people. How are we going to turn this around? I was on the group. We wrote a crackerjack report. It went right on a shelf where it collected a lot of dust. And the next time they got a turnaround task force, this time they didn't mess with dopes like me. They got Bill Nelson and Val Demings to head the thing up. And I got a call from Val Demings. You all know who she is. She was a former congressman from Orlando. And she said to me, and our Senate candidate, and she said, I just read your turnaround task force, and I thought it was really interesting. Why didn't anybody do any of this stuff? And I said, yeah, that's a really interesting question. That wasn't part of the turnaround task force job. And then she asked me an interesting question. She says, the thing I'm struggling with, it's a black woman, is why are we losing white working class people? And I said, Val, I'm older than you are, but I want to ask you a question. When is the last time the national or state Democratic Party prioritized a big public policy that was clearly and overtly directed at improving the life of working class people? She had nothing to say. Because we don't frame it that way. When we do something for working class people, we say, African Americans have been mistreated, Hispanic people have been mistreated, women have been mistreated, all of which I agree with. So we're going to have policies to help those people. And the working families, including women too, are going, well, yeah, but what about us? Well, you're privileged. One of my last things I had over at the college is they came to me and he said, we've got this young man and he's not adjusting well to this college. And we thought maybe by your background you could talk to him. I said, sure. It turns out this is a young man from Appalachia. I knew the area he's from. It's in my home state. And I sat down and talked to him. I said, what's going on here? And he says, well, people keep telling me I'm a privileged white person and that I shouldn't be talking in class because that's my perspective. He said, I came from a hometown where most people don't have indoor plumbing. I don't understand where this is coming from. What could I say? That wasn't the way we think about these things. Why was that? Well, one reason, it's sort of benign, in fact, sort of good, is that in the Democratic Party, when the Civil Rights Revolution came, we did something based on moral commitment that was not shrewdly in the interest of the party. We jettisoned the South and cost ourselves permanently a bunch of electoral votes to embrace the civil rights movement. And that created then organizations and institutions and interest groups around that particular interest. And they were successful in defining a lot of problems as racial and getting Democrats in particular to come up with ameliorative policies. And then women saw the same result and engaged in the same reaction and were successful. And it's a good thing in my mind that this happened. And then new groups came along and took the same model. LGBTQ, one after another. But what does that look like for the Democratic Party as an institution? If you go to the convention, Chris will tell you this, she knows this, there will be a black caucus, and there will be a Hispanic caucus, and there will be a LGBTQ caucus. I'm no way saying there's anything wrong with any of that. But you know what there isn't? A working man's caucus. An average family caucus. Not that average families aren't black and Hispanic, that's not the point. And what a lot of those efforts did was give people an impression that this is not your party. They're concerned with their experts and their client bases. And that was a major reason we just lost this election. So the change wasn't with the people, it was with the party. Now, it would be totally absurd for me to sit here and harp on Democrats as if they're the big problem in this story. But if we're going to get, and I'm saying this because I'm assuming many of you are on the side of, at least temporarily, the Democrats, given what we're facing, we got to get our act together and start talking to the people. All of them, not through intermediaries, not through experts, not through lawyers and HR directors and all of that stuff. Talk to the people and listen to them and get them involved. And honestly, we don't try. So that's where I want to start with people in this room. You guys are a big exception. You're out here doing stuff and you're reaching out and you have a common background and interest that gives you a way to move forward together. This is not really happening very much on our side. So we've got to get a new kind of culture and a new type of attitude, and we've got to come up with a way of talking to people about ethos. Now let's talk just a little bit what happened to the other party. Because when I remember, my theme is, it's not the people who changed. It's the options they're given and the institutions they're dealing with that have changed. The Republican Party, until fairly recently, had at its ideological core a historical basis in anti-communism that led them to various forms of political conservatism and a commitment to libertarian limited state policies. And I always thought that one of the things that protected this country to some extent from the extremism that's actually typical of right-wing parties abroad is that ours were so committed to libertarian kinds of ideas and principles, that the state should not be overly involved in our everyday life. And so there's a common ground there between civil libertarians on the left and civil libertarians on the right. And that creates a kind of protection from a very dangerous state. Now, when I say the state, I'm talking about the government, the whole shooting match, right? Now, think about that state. How has it changed? Also comprised now of experts. My nephew is one. He works for the EPA. I couldn't be prouder. He's gone up to the top. He does interagency negotiations with the Forest Service to figure out how they can burn fires to protect us from this stuff that's happening in California while not polluting the atmosphere to make the problem worse. I'm sure glad there's smart people like him working on this stuff. But it's so remote. The way they talk about it, the way they think about it is so remote for people that they will listen to the oil magnates and the billionaires who will tell them if we just deregulate everything, energy prices will plummet and we'll have no inflation. Because what do they know? Remember what I said about a rent. The point of the lying is not to convince people of the lie, it's to make them believe nothing, which in turn makes them subject to anything. That's the problem in a nutshell. Now we go back to the Republican Party and why we need to be very much concerned with them. Rather than changing their ideology to being pro-state, they criticize the state and say it's the deep state. And what is the deep state? Well, there are people in government who know things you don't know, who will act on that knowledge. And that makes them dangerous. And who are they? Well, they're sympathetic to black people. They're sympathetic to gay people. They're sympathetic to Hispanic people. They talk about all these issues all the time. So the attack is on the state. Let me remind you of another famous political party, and I'm not drawing moral equivalencies, it's not time for that, but just in the political science of it, that also came to power and took over the state by attacking the state. It was the Nazi Party. That's what they did. Too many cosmopolitans and Jews in the state. How can you trust them when we've got this high inflation? They're obviously not looking out for us. So we have to be extremely concerned about the changes within the Republican Party that is making it look completely like an authoritarian, right-wing political party, such as we see around the world everywhere. Well, I started by saying the American people aren't worse, but another thing we grew up believing is that it couldn't happen here, and that is wrong. It's happening here. One of our political parties is undergoing an institutional revolution to change its very nature into an authoritarian party that is profoundly anti-democratic. And you ask yourself, how can they get away with this spectacle of having an orgy of billionaires running things while trying to convince people that they're somehow doing their bidding? And it's because the people don't believe anything, and they have no trust in any of us. How could they have gone and voted for somebody like Donald Trump? Part of the answer is so many people are so profoundly cynical that they don't see a difference. And it's the institutions that are at the party there. Now, I picked on the parties, and I could do a whole different talk about something in the environment in which we operate that is even more important, and that's the change in the nature of communication. Back in 1964, we had something that political philosophers like to call the public sphere. And the public sphere is sort of an idea, but it manifests in reality. It's a place where people come and discuss and argue and consider in a public way where other people can respond and think. You connect the thinking people with average people. You connect ideas and ethos with action. A public sphere is absolutely a necessary condition for a proper democratic society, particularly on a national scale. In those days, we had a few national papers, but an amazing array of really terrific local newspapers. Like my hometown, the Louisville Courier-Journal, or the St. Petersburg Times, or the Des Moines Register. You can name dozens. They won Pulitzer Prize. They did great work. All of them are owned by Gannett, at best. You know what Gannett is. You get a newspaper where the public affairs section is 2 pages long. People aren't reading anymore. And that's the worst part, is what are they doing? They're on TikTok. They're on Facebook. I'm sorry, I quit. I know people say, we liked your Facebook posts. I'm not going to be a part of that anymore. When it's working well, it's full of disinformation. And it also pulls us into information ghettos where we only listen to people who agree with us. And on this score, the left's not much better than the right. Okay? We're living in little enclosed ghettos. We're not learning, as you do in the public sphere, how to reach out and unite and to persuade. That does not happen. And part of it has to do with the nature of the technology. All those newspapers are dead, and capitalism, because they weren't really profitable when you could provide people with information without great big printing presses and distribution networks. It seemed great at the time, but it changed the very nature of the message. And I'll confess to you, and I bet you most of you are the same, I don't read like I used to. Because I used to take a 300-page book and live in it. And I did this all the time. It was my job. That's why I took that job. I read books all the time. Now I was like, okay, where's the headline? Where's the emotional kicker that's going to tell me how really disgusting these other people are? We don't think enough. And we don't have forums in which we enable people to think. So we've got to work on the public sphere. I have no easy answer for how you change this communication problem. But the problems we're seeing here in the United States are global. Now let me say one last thing about this in the change in the institutional context. And this is a veterans group. And I got to tell you that I was very young in the Vietnam War, but definitely on your side. And it was a matter of some tension because I had 2 brother-in-laws in the war. And, I was a smart-ass kid. And I thought the war was all wrong. You guys know what that was like. It was tough. It caused a lot of upset. But one thing I never contemplated was that some of our political leaders would actually be in bed with the Russians. It's inconceivable. I mean, the Russians, for Christ's sake. Sorry, I know you're doing this, but the Russians? And that is a big threat too. Because you know what? The Russians are 10 years ahead of us in misinformation. A huge amount of the stuff you were getting in that campaign and pulling your hair out from was Russian propaganda, skillfully propagated across every kind of social media medium that you can think of, including many that you don't know about. And so when we start looking at these election results, we ought to be very concerned about the fact that I should have started with this, is the consensus among political scientists is that this was a very normal election with a really weird candidate. Incumbents have a tough time with the economy, they go down. Happened to George Bush, happens all the time. That's all that was going on here as far as the dynamics of the election was. The problem is they can consolidate power. All of the big change elections were after the fact, not before the fact. In the New Deal, Franklin Roosevelt never described anything looking vaguely like the New Deal when he ran for office. He got in there and he started doing things, pretty dramatic things, many of which were shot down by the existing political regime. I explained that term. The Libertarian Court said you can't do that stuff. And then he improvised. And they just made up a lot of stuff. But what they made up was what I like to call regime consolidation. They were identifying bunches of groups out there that had various different complaints, and they did stuff for them that were tangible and changed their lives. They electrified the South. There wasn't any electricity in the South prior to the New Deal. They developed the economy in ways that people could see. Did they abandon black people when they did it? Yes, they did. So it's not all paved in glory. But honestly, it was the only way they were going to get it done. So they went out and built support with the power they had. And that made a regime that was stable through the 1980s when Reagan, it finally ran out of gas when poor departed Jimmy Carter was president, who was sort of snake bit that way, and Reagan came in and changed it around. What we have to worry about now, this is my final comment, and what we all need to be most paying attention to is the distinction to what I call signal and noise. The noise is you nominate a bunch of clowns, the most outrageous bunch of clowns you've ever thought of to be in the cabinet. And people scream and yell. And you come up with awful proposals to start, again, discriminating against trans kids, which to me is just repulsive. But you're doing all these things because they please specific groups, and it's a consolidation of power. The New Deal coalition was a consolidation of power through government action and democratic support. Authoritarians take out the democratic support and make direct emotional appeals to the groups who are the most angry. And at this point, we start to look like not so much the United States of 1960, but the Turkey of Erdogan and the Hungary of Orban, both of whom, without having to engage in violent repression, have undermined the democracy of those regimes and consolidated power by giving to various different aggrieved groups symbolic things that they want. So what we have to try to distinguish between is the crazy stuff that's designed to provoke emotionally and focus in on how they're using policy and power to consolidate control in an undemocratic way. Because we can reverse every bad policy that they institute, but we can't resurrect democracy overnight if they change it. And that's our mission. We've got to fight for democracy, and we have to do it now. And that's all I want to say, and I'll stop now and be happy to take any questions. I hope I didn't depress you guys too much. I probably went long. I'm out of practice. Yes, so the question was, what's my prescription for fixing this problem? And when you make a structural argument, quick fixes are out of the question. I'm sorry, However, let me just ignore what I just said and give you one example. There's one thing that doesn't relate to that whole talk about structure, but I would like to see people on the other side of the aisle from the Republicans pick up. And that is, let's get tough. I'm going to give you some examples. If I had been president, Biden, and a few months into the regime, I saw the Ukraine war coming, understanding what that was going to do to gas prices of inflation. After COVID had already jacked up inflation to a tremendous degree. Instead of saying, folks, we're going to make a concerted effort to turn this thing around, I would have gone on TV and I would have said, look, when I ran for president, I told you things were bad under President Trump, but I had no idea how bad they were. Because President Trump's pussyfooting with the Russians gave them a green light to start a war of aggression. It's their fault. And now we're going to have this huge inflation problem, and there are no soft, easy ways to get that under control right away. We'll do our best. But he didn't frame it that way. And I saw an exit interview from, what's his name, Secretary Pete Buttigieg, and he said, we thought that if we went in and we did a really great job and people saw the result, that we would be rewarded. And I thought, man, for an intelligent person, that was a really stupid thing to say, because that is not how it works anymore. So we've got to start fighting tougher. Now, President Trump is still pussyfooting around with the Russians. Are we going to start saying that? Are we going to start calling them out? I have very serious security concerns with these clowns that he's put in charge there. Either they're going to use those institutions against us, or they're not going to be providing our security, which is an important thing. So I think we got to get tougher. And by the way, this is another little criticism I make of Democrats, and I'm not blaming Democrats for anything really, but one of the sort of tactical things we've done is stupid is we believe in demographic determinism. In other words, we say, well, the Latinos are on our side and they're increasing in numbers. Great, we're going to win in the long run. And what did they do? They went out and won over a bunch of Latinos, and it's through those techniques. And, so we can't do that where we just assume we've got groups. We got to go out and work with those groups. Yes. Again, that people are completely getting their information from Fox News, and tell me if I'm over-summarizing this, but that's part of how this isolation actually occurs. And he mentioned the incident where Fox actually paid off a lawsuit, $750 million, wasn't it? Some incredible amount of money, so that people just wouldn't know that they had lied about the whole thing. The most dangerous sentence in the English language today is, I did my own research. Because they get on a search engine and, they're not. Yes. And by the way, when I was listening to Change of Communication, I inadvertently left Fox out of there. And it's not just Fox, it's also iHeartRadio. They've got, working folks out driving around have that AM radio on all the time, and they're spewing out this nonsense nonstop. Tractors. People listen to Fox and iHeartRadio on their tractors. So it's going directly into their brain while they're occupied otherwise. So yes, this is a dramatic change in the way that, again, that constitution, that context. You said the guy's not a bad guy. He was never a bad guy, right? He's still not a bad guy. But if you're only listening to one thing, they're telling you they're bad people out there. You send your kid to school, they'll come home with a different gender. It's like, what? But what do they know? Why would people be saying it if it weren't true? So, this is what we're up against. And if I won the lotto and had $1 billion, one of the things I'd be working on is an alternative media system where and it's not MSNBC. It's something completely different where you're actually talking to people about their real life. I lived in Iowa in the 1990s. I taught at a small college there named Grinnell College. You may have heard of it. And it was fun because I got to see 2 caucuses. So I met all the presidential candidates, and it was really cool. And the thing that was so striking to me at that time was how sweet so many of the people were. And, we used to have a sort of pejorative statement in the household, which is, Iowa is fine for the Iowans. Because they were happy in this sort of rural, I'm a cosmopolitan person. I never got used to it. It's not the same place. Yes, and so I don't know how I'm not sure. It was sort of a dialogue, so I'm not sure how to summarize that. But first of all, you asked me if I'm in contact with the DNC. No. I've been focusing on learning how to make sourdough bread, and I'm happy to talk to him. I do like this Wilcox guy. So that was your first question. He's running for DNC chair. I think he's got the right idea. He's on the beam, and they did pretty well in Wisconsin. I forgot the second part.
The other part was the fact that we have Elon Musk.
Oh, Elon Musk. He asked about Elon Musk. That he gave an accurate characterization of him. Too kind in my estimation. Listen, when I said getting tough, here's probably the first thing we have to do is, I'm sick of these damn billionaires. Who gave them the right to play God? And Trump is buddying up with these guys. There is nothing about what they're doing that suggests to me in any way, shape, or form they want to improve the lot of ordinary people, which I think ought to be the point of a democratic country. And they're out of control. And as long as they're associated with Trump, we've got to point that out. The influence that I'm trying not to say bad words, but Musk is a very sick, weird individual, and he's imposing, first his personality, which is repugnant, but all kinds of preferences on all kinds of things. And he's going to go in and try to judge my nephew's got 35 years in the EPA doing good work for the American people. I'm sorry, Elon. No. Shut up. So let's start standing up to the billionaires. I don't think anybody wants to be ruled by these weirdos. I'm sorry for being pejorative. I generally avoid that. But let me just say that one of the things that I think we should be paying attention to is that, remember I was talking about regime consolidation. Donald Trump came to power, this being a normal election, because people were very dissatisfied with the state of the economy and the direction it was going in, not because they overlook Donald Trump and his flaws. He's got to consolidate power. And right off the bat, he put the billionaires in here with the Bannon folks, and they are not bedfellows. So he's going to have some problems going forward keeping together this pirate crew. One of the, okay, so that was another comment. It was sort of too good for me to quickly summarize without distorting it. But you're talking about the difficulty Democrats have in actually getting people out to vote. And I sense also because we're not appropriately motivating them somehow, I think is an important way to put it. And I'll tell you why. Is that I've watched the Democratic Party really beginning in 2008 develop and data availability and analysis has a lot to do with it. Incredible capacity to reach out to every single voter and harass them to death through every possible means, which tells, and we're really good at it. This Harris campaign was stunning at how good they were at putting together a terrifically efficient machine to communicate on the ground to people. And the fact that they're doing that and it's not working tells me the message is the problem. They're not perceived as delivering. Now, with Trump, the ironic thing, since a great deal of what he's delivering is emotion, it's easy to deliver on resentment and anger and to blame certain outgroups and say they're the problem. Immediate success there, they're getting their reward by the warm jollies they feel because they think somebody's finally listening to their grievances. The Democrats try to deliver on public policy. I think that industrial policy that Biden passed was like a dream come true for me. It's great. I remember my first day in graduate school, I took a comparative public policy class, and the professor assigned these articles on European industrial policy. And I read this stuff, and I just thought, oh my God, I'm living in a totally backward country. Because these other countries do this stuff successfully, and it doesn't result in socialism or state control of everything. It actually works. Lo and behold, we actually went and did it. Do y'all know all about that? Not really. It could be one of the most groundbreaking pieces of legislation in the history of the United States, and most people don't have a clue what really happened. So we're just not doing a very good job of this. An interesting, maybe case study we should all study is my home state of Kentucky has a great governor. His name is Andy Beshear. I love Andy Beshear. And Andy Beshear, as governor in the reddest of red states, got reelected, and actually by a pretty comfortable margin. How did he do it? He got Ford to put their new EV efforts in the state of Kentucky. They're building a couple of gigantic factories. They're hiring 50,000 new employees. UPS World Headquarters is in Louisville. He got them to double down on their commitment, and they're promising 50,000 jobs over the next 20 years. Good jobs, high-paying jobs. Jobs that'll make a difference. This is what Biden was about, but Andy was at the groundbreaking. Andy was at the legislature. Andy was at strike headquarters when the UAW had their strike. My brother is a union member there, and he said they were all shocked one day when Andy Beshear, the governor, walks into strike headquarters. Said, hey, I just wanted to give you guys a shout out and tell you I'm behind you. He was in the middle of a campaign. Okay, so he did it. And I think he gives us a model of what we have to be doing.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you, Keith. I'll just make one point before we adjourn. Keith mentioned ethos, and one thing that we can be really proud of with our group, we have an ethos. And that ethos is speaking truth to power. And one way that we can do it in Florida, we can get some information out to people. We have high utility rates. We have high insurance rates. We have climate change problems. The reason we have a lot of those problems are because the billionaires are setting the agenda in Tallahassee. And so we have to let our friends and neighbors know about that, and the communications from our group, we have to really push on that. Like Keith said, to be tough, but being tough means tell the truth. And the truth is, as Floridians, we're being screwed. They're taking the money right out of our pockets, and we need to help our fellow citizens understand that. So with that, if there's no further announcements, meeting adjourned.